So good evening, everyone, and good evening, sir. Good evening, Vijay, sir. So this is the last, I should say, because we planned 4 webinars in this quarter, where we have already done 3 webinars on different topics, and this is going to be the last webinar for this quarter, where we will be discussing about the primer on bioproperty. So we have a great privilege to have Mr. Vijay Raghavan from Sadhguru Management Consultant. So who will be taking this session, basically primarily on the bioproperty. So before we invite Vijay Raghavan sir for this session, we would like to request Dr. Shashendu Mukherjee, who is the Mission Director GCI Grand Challenges India and leading the team of IP and technology transfer at BIREC. We request you, sir, to briefly introduce about the today's speaker and the purpose of having these webinars. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Vinita, and our most respected and my dear friend, Dr. Professor Vijay Raghavan, and my colleagues in BIRAC and all the Amit as well as Sanchita and all my fellow attendees today for this webinar. And we are privileged to have Professor Vijay Raghavan today, who is a great friend of personally to me and to the entire community of technology transfer and this IP professional in this country, not only in this country but around the globe as well. He is one of the first RTTPs in India, and he really mentors and leads this entire technology transfer and IP movement in this country, because from his professional leadership which he does through his organization Sadhguru, and through giving the leadership to STEM, which is the only professional body in India which is a body of technology transfer professionals. So we have all learned from him and continue to learn from him in his in his endeavors to promote TTOs. BIRAC has been really working very closely with creating this environment, and with Professor Vijay Raghavan as well, to create the capacities in technology transfer professional in this country through the National Biopharma Mission, and also through BIRAC in itself, through the team at BIRAC, Vinita, Amit, and Sanchita. We are all dedicated and committed to that, to build that. And in that endeavor, we are doing this series of webinars, and to have a basic interactions and knowledge sharing in various elements of these various issues in technology management, transfer, as well as IP management. So this is one of the series of webinars, and through the National Biopharma Mission, we have created technology transfer officers, which is again thanks to Vijay's leadership, I think, which he had really brought in the concept when we were discussing the National Biopharma Mission. I was asked also to introduce Professor Vijay, but I think Vijay it just showing some candle to the sun if I have start introducing Vijay, and it will run I think longer than Vijay's webinar. Well, he has so many credentials, so many feathers in his cap, but I think just in very short, we all know he's the CEO of Sadhguru, a global innovation and advisory and technology management organizations in India, but offices globally. He was the first RTTP in this country, that is what, and now he has led this movement, and right now through his mentorship and through NBM and through BIRAC support, as well as these TTO offices which we have been created, we have created around 26 or 27 RTTPs in this country. He has a global engagement with academic institutions and industries for research, result, monetization. I know that is one of his big, criteria, the research monetization, which is very, very important. We all do research, and I was talking to our Honorable Secretary this afternoon. He has very, very strong ideas that research should lead to monetizing. That doesn't mean we should start earning money from the day one, but it should lead to somewhere where an exit strategy can be built, so that innovation can be really spun off to a business enterprise. I think that's what I think Vijay is very famous for, and he has led that movement as well. So he research monetization, market creation, and also he holds an academic position in the Cornell University as regional director of life science research. He has extensively engaged in long-term advisories to innovation hubs, innovation ventures, and large corporations in spearheading changes through contemporary innovation and market delivery. I think this is very short. I could really sum up Vijay's, but I think Vijay has many credentials and feathers in his cap, which I think we all know who is in the field. So without much ado, may I now request Professor Vijay Raghavan to enlighten us, and is going to speak on primers on bioproperty. Over to you, Professor Vijay.
Thank you, Dr. Mukherjee. I think it was such a sweet introduction. I actually say that as a peer and as a mentor, I gained so much from you. I would have no ways to thank you for that. I think I certainly greatly recognize and appreciate Dr. Vinita picking this very important theme today, bioproperty especially. We look at primarily numerous living organisms as property. And by definition, property relates to having fundamental right to control. Anything where we have fundamental right to control, either by your possession or application of that, or sale or gift or donate, that's the connotation of the property with fundamental right to control. Property types can be many, to this audience. I don't have to explain that much. It could be tangible, intangible, intellectual. The important thing is that, the bioproperty are basically products of nature, substantially the products of nature in original form or in modified form or improved form. They're all, like the tools for a carpenter. Without the tools, the carpenter can't just create any asset at all. So bioproperty is very, very fundamental to any kind of biological invention that we're pursuing typically. They could be in many forms. The basic fact is that, when it comes to legal possession, the possessor of the tangible property is the owner typically. Unless the owner has transferred that right through a bailment, technology, transfer or knowledge transfer is all through bailment process. Primarily when we provide access to the technology, either by way of licensing or any other way, or when the property is stolen. So one thing about bioproperty is that physical possession is so critical. Just not owning the asset, but it's also ensuring that the physical possession is ensured. Otherwise, a product of nature can be lost without any identity that's clearly, reflecting our ownership there. So physical management of bioproperty is the critical stewardship, both in public domain as well as private domain. And you have property either way, either by control of the physical ownership or by bailment, which provides you access to deploy the property. So what is important in bioproperty as distinct from rest of the intellectual assets we look at is that typically property control position is one that drives the value for it. There are a number of property control types in a bioproperty. It could be patents, depending on country where the innovation is originating. There are a number of countries which recognizes patenting products of nature. Material control transfer, whereby certain material gets passed on from the possessor to the user, or if it's kind of plant breeders' rights in another form, or trade secret or trademarks. All of these are combinations, but much less patent protection. We had tremendous amount of patent protection in the 80s and 90s for products of nature, but certain landmark, judgments such as the myriad genetics judgment for BRCA1, BRCA2 genes made it really difficult for products of nature to secure broad spectrum patents, and that really brought down, quite a bit of intellectual property control through patents for bioproperty. Of course, the myriad genetics case itself differentiated between genomic DNA and cDNA because cDNA had intron removed and therefore enhanced functionality. So there are a number of elements where bioproperty has been still protected under patent, but there is a broad spectrum of other options there. So property control determinant is through combination of these protections that we normally exercise. And stewardship is very, very important because these are products of nature. The deployment is many times regulated, and therefore, product stewardship also is critical when kind of bailment takes place. What are the bioproperty access and licensing strategy? Primarily, if you look at it, there are two broad spectrum of bailees here. One is the academic institution that have no commercial intent but want to develop a product, establish a proof of concept, get into discovery and validation. So that's one part of it. There's also the translational validation by academic institutions in order to create an end product of value. That's the second part of it within the academic domain. Within the industry, it's the same way: testing, validation, prototyping as a proof of concept, and then enhancing that to next stage of commercial application. Now, in bioproperty, we structure the licensing models very uniquely, and that's really the intrinsic element of bioproperty monetization. There are a number of options there. We use several bioproperty for testing. It could be looking at the suitability of the particular platform, and we look at licensing bioproperty for sales only. When you have companies that are engaged in selling bioproperty, such as reagents for that matter, or testing animals, development, production, and sale of all of these, giving full rights to an entity, or allowing them to be genetically engineered, or creating genetic markers from that. So these are elements of further improvement that may be allowed or not allowed. So there are a number of options that happens for access mechanism, and therefore, unlike general IP that are patent underlying as asset, the bioproperty gets tailored licensing terms generally. And that's an important element of the bioproperty. Now, there are a number of external frameworks influencing bioproperty access mechanisms. The main one, of course, is when it comes to plants and animals, the biodiversity laws are so critical. Identification and access benefit sharing are governed by the original Rio Convention and then Nagoya Protocol after that. However, there are a number of countries that are not signatory to that, and therefore it's not universal there today. India is, of course, a very, very strong draconian biodiversity law that limits tremendous amount of access today. And then there are ethical guidelines, basically on applying products of nature, both for human, animal on the one hand, and plants on the other. So these are to be followed, especially ethical elements involving humans and animal quarantine restrictions. Biosafety, because these are live, pathogens, live organisms. Biodefense related frameworks are important. Each country has prescribed them. There are quarantine, import-export restrictions, and these are something where one needs to be binding, when they get into transactions related to bioproperty access. Now let's look at the bailment approach for bioproperty. I talked about the bioproperty being the tool for the carpenter. The first thing is that we need to look at for each of these bioproperty, what kind of access tool is available today. A property control tool is available today. Depending on the country where they originate, depending on the country where they are deployed, depending on the institution or entity generating it. So these are first and foremost element to look at which are the protection control that we can exercise, and then look at marketplace use for them that may have multivarious applications for it. So that's the second part of it, and develop the business strategy based on the number one and number two elements there clearly. There are elements of geographic aspect to be considered, because there are countries where you may not be allowed to take them to for bailment. There could be restrictions on exports clearly. There are also restrictions on trade related controls. So I think these are some of the things that would be binding, as an approach for us. And then how do we ensure property control post bailment? These are also important element. Where do we really archive these? Where do we create a repository of them? So those are important things that come in there. And that's how these whole, planning a clear strategy for bioproperty consists of these key elements there. Now let's look at the various models of bioproperty ownership and licensing. We looked at the ownership earlier, where the property control is by possessor, typically, unless those products of nature are being protected under patent or under the plant variety protection. Generally, due to limitation on patent protection, they're all by control of possession as such. And when we look at bailment, we invariably use the material transfer agreement as a kind of a important access framework, routinely used to exchange, all kinds of organisms. In a way, MTAs are again not very specific. They can be tailor-made, but they do restrict distribution, defines the uses and disposition on termination. May not have financial terms in it invariably, because these are all supplemented by clearly contractual agreements. The option to move to commercialization at times can be kept open in MTAs as well, conferring ownership or bailment over a period of time. Let's look at different tangible property and how do we really look at strategizing their access framework. The first is the tangible research property. 2 out of 3 transfers in the world happens as tangible research property. Overall, if you look at it, this segment, mice, antibodies, cell lines, these are some good examples of tangible research property. World over, the bioproperty commercial market is growing substantially. It's almost at the level of about $30 to $32 billion today, and a number of elements do come in there in the commercial opportunity. Worldwide, there are numerous opportunities for possessors of the property, and today we look at licensing income from bioproperty at the level of about $2 to $2.2 billion today. So it's a very, very consolidated, strong market world over. And tangible research properties are clearly one major segment, where limited patenting scope prevails today, but how enormous commercial value remains because of numerous access needs both by the researchers in the public system and the private system. Now, the tangible research properties are, a lot of them get originated from public research institutions, and some, of course, from the commercial private sector that are, repositories of tangible research property. Normally, public institution would market them on their own website. What I've provided on the right hand is a website of one of the large repository in the United States. If you look at it, they have research tools, antibodies, vectors, reagents, cell lines, enzymes, oligonucleotides, hybridization, protein synthesis, a whole lot of range of bioproperty one can think of. And if you go into each one of them, you would find the repositories of those that are available. And these are normally on a shrink wrap kind of an access with fixed price provided. Some of them come with stipulations of future benefit sharing, but several of them are kind of one-time payment, and some are on annual fee payment basis. So a lot of institutions do provide access to research tools and several other bioproperty repositories on their website. And of course, there are third-party distribution models which are popular. A lot of major mega companies have billions of dollars of revenue coming from third-party distribution of bioproperty. Several of them, in most cases, are non-exclusive licensing model, again, because product of nature, like to have a broader spectrum of application for that. Numerous repeat customers. If you look at a tech transfer office of a large university, the busiest person would be one who's handling bioproperty in that entity, because the number of transactions they do continuously, and the nature of transactions they do, though they are lesser value, they would be a significant deal creator in any university system. Now there are a number of uniquely structured model agreements, material transfer agreements for transfer of bioproperty. One of the things that over a period of time we have perfected is the research purposes only transfers inter-CA academia or from a private repository to academic research. These are generally less restricted in governance, more on notifying improvements that are created for the bioproperty, and then determining a manner in which the improvements will be protected. Again, there are model agreements for experimental use by the private entities, which are somewhat different from what they are for providing the TRPs for academic research. In case of experimental use by private entities, there are also restrictions on notifying their application, especially when it comes to human subject testing or animal testing and validation. Also notifying on any kind of improvements that is worthy of patent to be notified. So I think there are important elements that comes when it comes to biometric experimental use, permits. There could be a combination of an option for commercial application, where experimental use commercial applications are quite often sought by private enterprises to have a continuum for their discoveries, so that they can have clarity about investment strategy in those kind of inventions. There are, of course, property elements such as transgenic animals as bioproperty. Again, wide spectrum of public repositories, such as the Mutant Mouse Research and Research Center at NIH. You can go into the site and see different kind of species, So, and then there are hybridomas across the world, which provide you the access to them. And there are academic custom development centers, which have custom developed, animals, transgenic animals. There are also private enterprises distributing animals for transgenic model, and they are much more hot and trending indications that are preferred by industry today. So they are more commercial in nature. So I think these are one of the major worldwide, access to bioproperty today that are quite, prolific. Now, some time ago, in 14 or so, institutions, got together and developed, with ANH taking the lead, a uniform biological material transfer agreement, UBMTA. That really became one of the model, agreements for transfer of material inter-C public institutions. Again, the original material, or the progeny or unmodified derivatives are covered in that, but then the modifications are not really a access granted there. Unmodified derivatives also not really the access granted there. So the use of material is fine in research, but then substances created by the recipient, to improve would require again notification to the provider there. And then there are quite a bit of protection covenants for indemnification of the provider of the material, from several liabilities that may arise when you transfer bioproperty, really speaking. So the UBMTA is quite extensively applied inter-C public researchers when it comes to bioproperty transfer. Inter-C bioproperty transfer among the institutions are also have been facilitated with the master UBMTA that has also provided the opportunity for collaborating in research today. And there are distinct animal transfer agreements, which are important because when it comes to animal transfer, beyond, of course, the property protection, there are also compliance to national acts and, of course, the general ethics of animal welfare. Many countries have Animal Welfare Act that needs to be complied with, and adherence should be ensured. And therefore, the agreements also enforce those compliances as well. Otherwise, they are pretty much like any other MTA for bioproperty transfer. Ethical practices are a very key element there, and therefore they may insist on not just ethical practice, prescribed by law, but also in entity, policy or enterprise policy for adoption of these ethical practices. Biosafety compliance is important because these animals carry pathogens or diseases, or model, bioproperty, and therefore, restrictions on some of them might require containment and confinement. Those biosafety compliance are also very, very important there. And of course, the biological material commercial use agreement. This is the major, bioproperty commercial, market today that remains almost about $20 billion today, quite widely, prevalent for pharmaceutical industry, human health, animal health, and also agriculture, such as seed industry today or crop protection industry. These commercial agreements are quite varied in nature, invariably recognize the background IP relating to bioproperty, where the licensor recognizes the underlying bioproperty that are secured by the asset owner for derivative product licenses, and there could be a number of them. The background IP in any kind of life science asset that are bioproperty would be numerous in many cases, and those are all important to recognize in any of these transfer license agreements. Typically, these are industry standards that mice today, when you go from a good institution or a private entity, could be anywhere between $10,000 to $50,000. Antibodies are much cheaper. Cell lines are also somewhere priced in between mice and antibody. All of them carry in a way a minimal annual fee, so that it's easy to track where those bioproperty are existing, and for the research user also, they do see the value of that. Therefore, they end up paying minimal annual fee, and of course, when the final product gets to licensed out or commercialized, there are royalties in a number of cases there. So that's generally the broad model of biological material commercial license agreement system. Now, in many cases, if I were an institution providing bioproperty to an entity, either a public or private, to a country about which I'm not very familiar with the bioproperty restrictions and biosafety covenants, and also the contractual enforcement frameworks, I do enter into a kind of a patent non-assert stipulation where the bailment doesn't exist, but I agreed not to enforce my rights in the user, normally the patent non-assert stipulations help the user to enjoy the possession of the bioproperty and deploy it in their research or commercialization, but absolves me of the responsibility or keeps me away from the legal limitations that prevail there. Indemnification is certainly a solution, but many times, indemnification by the agency, the recipient, may be of no value to me due to their own limitations to indemnify me, really speaking. So several of the bioproperty in unknown territories, when they are made accessible, the patent non-assert stipulations come in quite handy for us. Now there are numerous global sources of TRPs from public research as well as the private entities. The largest, of course, being the ATCC, American Type Culture Collection. I'm sure a lot of you have accessed bioproperty from them. It's one of the largest repositories today, with about 85,000 collections in different spheres, basically, human, animal, plant. Numerous amount of clinical biospecimens and biodefense. COVID, it was one of the most accessed repository today. And they're also an international treaty depository, so they do carry global material. And interestingly, they have, for private sector, they're kind of a safe vault for proprietary bioproperty, which is run by them as a commercial service. Now, ATCC has been, over the years, enhancing their access fee for bioproperty, because they also been finding it, difficult to sustain. They were originally federally funded to a large extent, but their federal funding has been declining quite less to somewhere around less than 20%. And then therefore they became, one dependent on the use and access fee they get. There are, of course, bioproperty that they manage for third party. Those are all provided on terms that are agreed to by the third party. And therefore, ATCC is also looking at the commercial sustainability for themselves. And there are national repositories. NIH is one of the excellent national repositories. We found in Europe, and we do quite frequently access from Europe, several bioproperty, the Danish, the Dutch one, and there's Irish one, and then there are quite a number of, and then of course there are bodies like Fraunhofer, etc. The number of university biobanks, that are quite rich in repository, including Cornell. So I think these are some of the, excellent repositories that one would have. There are non-profit repositories, especially for human, animal, and plant, such as CIRAD and plants. These are all the good sources to look at. There are very specialized, repositories, such as, the CG system created for some of them. For fish, you have, of course, the one interesting one that has repository of marine aquatic cell lines. For the plant, of course, you have the major repository in the gene bank, the global gene bank, supported by FAO, and then the consultative group, which has crop-specific gene banks again. Those are excellent repositories for plants. All of these are provided on an access binding, approach. Some of them are priced, and there are benefit flows that comes in. But things like CG system today, they don't look at benefit flow back, but the rest of them, several of them look at benefit flow back. So broadly, we would say categorize access as free access, kind of limited access. Limited access could be purpose driven. In case of COVID, a lot of repositories provided limited access for addressing either therapeutic or preventive products for COVID, or limited access in restricted category, which is such as COVID, I would say, or the investor-based access. There are again bodies such as Gates Foundation that have been securing access pro bono for some of the forefront frontline public research pursued by the investees. So I think these are some of the models that applies today for access mechanism. Typically, all of these are non-exclusive. Very, very defined field of use. The fee also will be for defined field. There are complex elements of royalty stipulations in some of them because these are, underlying, technical property. So I think these are some of the structured element that comes in even if you access the bioproperty from repositories. And there are, of course, a number of private sector distribution networks, both big and small. The ones like Life Technologies or Melipur or Sigma are billion-dollar companies, but there are a number of small players here who are specialized in terms of providing bioproperty for human as well as animal and plant research. In terms of pricing, based on application, eukaryotic or prokaryotic, they do have tremendous amount of return flow, by way of property monetization as royalties and milestone payments. Very, very strong in licensing teams in them. They constantly scout for public, outcome of bioproperty identification. IP is protected as well as repositories made, and then they take up agencyship for them. A very wide network of marketing globally. A lot of them, somebody like Life Technologies would have 50,000 plus materials with them that have wide spectrum of application value today. So these are mega companies, as well as there are close to about 250 odd smaller entities in different countries that are excellent repositories of bioproperty. Of course, you do have in India, the NBPGR, which is excellent repository of plant resources, and there are, each country has certain repositories that are of national repositories providing access to bioproperty as well. The other important element of bioproperty is biological isolates. These are isolates from plants or microorganisms in nature. Could be a microorganism from that soil-borne, maybe a soil-borne pathogen, or it can be a plant-derived microorganism. So these are, biological isolates, and they are the second largest, I would say, bioproperty globally. They go through various kind of discovery by corporate entity, with a wide spectrum of samples available, universities and foundations, especially with the microbiome research now. Numerous library of isolates are created today for further enhancing them and applying them into commercial products. So it used to be 10,000 samples. Today we have hundreds of thousands of samples due to microbiome research. In terms of the leads, they narrow down, to hundreds of leads, and then finally, narrow down to very, very few products there. So it takes a long pipeline of 6 to 8 years from identification of isolates to finally determining their commercial value, and numerous ones, myriads of them, just drop out at some point in the development process. So these are provided on a research use access or experimental use access to private sector, research use access to public sector, but they're tracked. They're tracked, and there are annual fee for their application. Due to long span of commercialization, there are milestone payments that arises here, and most of these products are in regulated markets. So they are also in a way milestone to regulatory advancement. There are still biodiversity challenges because a lot of them are plant or environment derived. If it's a soil-borne pathogen in India, for example, you're bound by National Biodiversity Authority to secure approval, and then provide the benefit flow to the authority, as stipulated in the law. So there are biodiversity challenges there. Again, biodiversity challenges are different for domestic company and international company in countries such as India. So those are elements that come in there. So the derivative of these could be botanical drugs. There could be numerous botanical drugs that are derived from bioproperty. It could be dietary supplements or nutraceuticals, or a big segment today, such as curcumin from curcumin derivative, or lycopene, say from tomato or papaya for that matter, or alternate foods or alternate value products such as stevia, for sweetener. Hemp is now going to be the biggest bioproperty that's numerously valued and accessed by licensing, especially in hemp. The THC content, tetrahydrocannabinoid, should be less than 1.5%. So there are breeders today who have domesticated hemp with THC content of less than 1.5%. There are very valuable genetics today. So, and then there are food applications, pharma applications, and industrial applications in hemp. So I think that's become very, very valuable bioproperty today. There are also value to some of the auxiliary technologies. When these botanical drugs are developed, such as analytical chemistry, the database, the bioassays developed, and the regulatory dossier itself. These are also again intellectual assets that gets tagged along to bioproperty value. Plant-based drugs are very, very important, very high value. You all would know the University of Southern Florida made $1 billion+ from Taxol, one product from yew tree. Traditionally, the artemisinin from Artemisia annua, the malarial disease drug, has also been a big value creator. So there are numerous plant-based drugs that have got the bioproperty access beneficiary. Some of them are actually bestsellers with the $1 billion revenue today. All of these have regulated product structure. In some countries, there are basically regulations on use of the product of nature, the plant itself. There are some countries on the way the derivative can be deployed in the market, with claims, without claims. There are some countries that restrict for certain field of use. Some may allow in cosmetics, but not in drugs for that matter, or in drugs but not in food and matter. Trademarks are important, property here that gets tagged along, where the products are in the market, providing the developer advantage of the double dip. Then the number of, again, property protection that we exercise in case of botanical drugs, because the plant variety itself, we're providing a high lycopene tomato as a trade to the licensee, that gets plant variety protection and therefore enjoys an advantage. There are patents for methods applied. Some countries, there could be patent for the plant itself, basically with the claim of high lycopene content. Trademarks protection. So we use combination of property protection for botanical drugs today. And some of these are again, excellent blockbuster assets today. We talked about biodiversity, that's critical in botanical drugs. Patent prosecution challenges, especially for derivatives. Again, a lot of them are classified as products of nature. Many countries don't have patent protection for microorganisms or derivatives for that matter. Uncertainty in the regulatory pathway for some of them classified as naturally derived products, some don't. So determining those pathways, especially because of uncertainty for benefit flow, milestones, clinical validation, quality appliances, standards are evolving in them. So there are a lot of uncertainties in determining the valuation itself and the benefit flow. And some of them would require very, very industry-specific knowledge for us to develop those pathways of benefit sharing models there today. Field of use determination is very critical. We find that, for example, if you look at curcumin, it was originally, applied in one subtype of cancer. Potentially, then it was realized that it could have application in several subtypes. So the field of use expanded. So gradually, it became more and more restricted field of use to bailment contractees, basically. The time versus return is uncertain again, and therefore number of cases until they come to proof of concept to scale up validation. Option agreements are exercised invariably, and then license agreements are long drawn, frontline, several milestone driven structures today. Botanical drugs are a big opportunity, but the market growth is phenomenal. And therefore, extrapolating the market growth itself is something that needs good feel for the industry as such. The important thing we see is in all of these, challenge of the bioproperty disposal in case of rescission of the contract or withdrawal of the product, by the bail. You have numerous products out in the testing or in the industry, the company, or with the regulator. So all of that remain at large. Disposal of them are very, very strongly stipulated in these agreements with evidence of disposal. The other important bioproperties plants. Plants as a bioproperty have numerous value. They really provide the largest value proposition because two of the segments, seed industry as well as crop protection industry. Crop protection, as a derivative product from plants, but the seed industry with the plants as such are one of the largest segment of the bioproperty value creation today. The wild plants, of course, are public resource accessible, but some of them are today on a price clearly, because a lot of the repositories do struggle to maintain them and to cover the cost. There is always a stipulation of a contribution of the price one time generally. But plants as a personal property and bioproperty are one that are developed with breeding, conventional or contemporary breeding. So plants as IP has been a major source of global value today. Several countries do provide for patenting, plants. Improved traits are accessible. Or protectable claims in countries like United States today, Australia, Korea. But there are a number of countries who do not have mechanism or framework for protecting plants under patents regime. So they all go by the plant variety protection regime. Again, they could be, UPAW or sui generis framework for that. It's a little, the plant variety protection is a very heterogeneous system because of number of countries having, their own variated frameworks. Trademarks are important protection. We'll see some examples of how trademarks have contributed to a plant as a property. Invariably, you blend, at least 2 or 3 of the 5 protections we talked about when it comes to plants as a bioproperty. And the combination of them actually provides tremendous strength for asset owner as well as the bailee to put them into commercial application in their own right. So in terms of plants, it could be germplasm or developed lines. There could be a wide spectrum of selections, which are intermediary products basically. Varieties are one that are developed in the public system, made available to private entities. They use it as a base material generally for developing their own lines. Traits are specific properties incorporated in plants that are distinctly identifiable. They go through a validation for their distinctiveness and usefulness and stability. There are, of course, the QTLs, which are also important, element of bioproperty that can be, enhanced in the plant itself or in other plants for that matter through trade transfer. So these are some of the important, plant property. And the reality is that when you talk of a line as a property, it might contain numerous pedigrees as a background property in it. So that's where there's our complex element when it comes to plants as a property. And then there are transgenic plants, plants that have one or more alien gene in it, expressing protein. So these are further complex because you also have a gene of interest that's alien, and that could invariably be protected under IP. These are genes that are enhanced in value. Maybe they are codon optimized or they are fusion. And then, so therefore, they have invariably patent protection. So the component of a genetic construct would have numerous bioproperty in it, the gene of interest, the promoter, the markers, terminator. So each one of them would have underlying patent for it. So while the PVP is limited in protecting plants, underlying assets within that transgenic plant itself would have numerous property protection for them. And therefore, when you license it, the combination of those property protection provides access to the licensee as such. There are, of course, some bioproperty which are accessed from repositories here again. So they may have their own stipulations of benefit. It could be, getting a transformation vector from one of the repository, which would have stipulations of maybe one-time payment or recurring payment for them. And there are, methods, patterns, such as regeneration methods adopted in transgenic that would also have certain patent protection. That might also be something that may have to be access to. Examples are numerous the world over. The BT corn is the largest trade. Hundreds of billions of dollars of BT corn trade has been licensed by inventor entities to almost like 50-60 licensees today. BT corn trade value at some point was close to about $3.5 billion. These are followed by the trades in cotton, the BT cotton, BT canola, BT soybean. So those are some of the global widely recognized high value trades. Some of them are publicly developed, but several of them are eventually translated by private sector into specific crops with a specific field of use. A lot of them are fusion, they're stacked. So what you find is that these, by crossing, they do accumulate more and more traits. It could have 3 or 4 traits. There are as much as 12 traits stacked in one of the Monsanto's product. So those are complex, stacking of bioproperty in them would have numerous underlying patterns or plant variety protection or bioproperty access restriction control in them. So the freedom to operate is complex in them to have full ability for licensees to deliver products in their own right. The plant property goes through different kind of benefit sharing. Upfront payment are a must generally because the developer would have spent long years in developing the property. If you take a good corn line, it would have taken like 6 to 8 years to develop it. But some of the fruit trees, such as apple, would take even anywhere between 10 to 15 years for the breeders to bring to the fore, a trade factor. Royalty rates are in various forms. Invariably per unit, it could be per unit of plantlet sold. It can be per unit of seed sold, but value of seed sold. It could be per period, such as annual recurring fee, where some of these are used for crossing, for example, in their breeding program. Startups, of course, do have preference for equity today. So a lot of commercial contemporary startup entities engaged in contemporary breeding with gene editing and other tools they do access bioproperty, and some of the institutions have made excellent gains even in the last 3 years by taking equity in them as they mature to validation period. Some of them profit driven, where the models of bioproperty are quite numerous, but it's easy for the user to provide the revenue and then take a piece of it as a profit. Tremendous plant bioproperty comes with trademark registration. For example, one of the trademarks that really was licensed was the Bolgard for cotton in India, and the trademark license fee was paid by almost 30 odd licensees to the asset owner when they were licensed for Indian markets today. So it's a complex element to license a transgenic plant property because of, I said, numerous background IP. Invariably, you end up with the royalty stacking because all of these background IP would have some obligations of benefit share, and therefore, we do end up, creating royalty stacks. There are fusioning of royalty, when it comes to stacking, with certain, cap on what maximum payable to some of the background IP owners. So it gets into a kind of a model where royalty stacks are determined, and some of them would require renegotiation with some of the background IP providers for modifying pre-existing contracts. So those are some of the things that happens when it comes to transgenic plant property. It's also true of transgenic animals today that really are commercially today, such as transgenic fish today. Biomaterial disposal is a critical factor because these are subject to two elements. One, as a bioproperty, biosafety element comes in there, and they are transgenic. They are not yet, elements that are released environment, so they are biohazards, and therefore anything that's not put to market with proper validation of environmental assessment would have to be disposed of, mandated by a number of laws and regulations. So those are very, very intrinsically stipulated in these agreements. So negotiating agreement would have a number of covenants, including indemnification itself. Because these are regulated products, indemnification of the property provider becomes very critical. Intellectual property can be, again, plant breeders' rights. Could be the primary material or derived material. A lot of derived material go through plant breeders' rights. Utility patents on traits in countries where they are allowable, some of Europe and US. Utility patent on lines, trade secrets and trademarks. Certification marks are, more like what you see geographically indicators in some countries like the United States. So these are some of the protections that you have. There are other plant breeding IP assets, breeding methods, for example, molecular markers, which are excellent bioproperty for licensing. Then there are trade secrets, which we talked about. Trade secrets are numerous assets that today the plant research industry, especially seed industry, has got, because you got myriads of accession that comes into your possession, your pipeline products, your validation products, your parental lines, and those are all clearly trade secrets. Protection is only by property control that you ensure within yourself for the physical possession of the property itself. And some illustrative licensing models, we can have numerous models, but in the interest of limitation of time, I'm talking about some of the mega models that really provide. This is something where in our organization, we have looked at and over the years made numerous licenses. Our interest in bioproperty licensing has been in all the three segments: human, animal, and plant. Substantially in human for pharmaceutical research, animal for, again, pharmaceutical research, as well as for the food and nutraceutical industry, and plants, of course, for the seed industry and crop protection industry. Apple rootstock is one that is today, these are numerous, development timeline based. It takes years to develop a good apple rootstock. Rootstocks actually determine the size of the tree that's bearing the apple, and the scions are grafted on them. Scions are the varieties of the apple. Cornell, of course, the world leader in apple rootstock. There are others such as Washington University. So Geneva rootstocks are most popular in the world, along with a number of rootstocks that come from New Zealand and Washington, in fact, and also parts of, one or two countries in Europe. Rootstock licensing is quite ubiquitous. Today, millions of dollars of royalty flow comes from rootstock licensing. The way we look at rootstock licensing is that we would look at suitability of the rootstock in the region, and it takes about 2 to 3 years to validate performance of the rootstock in a local environment with different scions that may be responsive to that, and then they are transferred. We do have experimental use license initially, but then the bioproperty is quite extensively applied, for commercialization with the predetermined licensing rights. Benefit flows are in terms of license fee. Number of the rootstocks come with a hefty licensing fee of $1 million+ in regions that are quite extensively growing these crops. When the royalty flow comes in terms of tree royalty, these are charges per tree sold. Annual minimum royalty as always stipulated. They also go with Geneva as a trademark for that matter, and there are a number of trademarks, about 30 of them globally. They go with trademarks licensing for the rootstocks as well, which the property, bailment provides rights for them to use the trademark. In each country, we would insist on PVP filing or patent filing, as the case may be, and that provides the licensee the right of reproduction of rootstock and sale in the markets. Generally, these are non-exclusive in major countries, but in some countries, emerging markets, we do provide exclusive. Along with that goes the varietal license, which are varieties developed, such as Snapdragon or Honeycrisp, Red Delicious, that's been there for a long time. These are again non-exclusive generally, because there are several nurseries that would license them, and again the royalties by way of royalty per tree sold. So a good nursery, global nursery, might provide royalty on rootstocks as well as variety of the scion, and therefore kind of stacked as a royalty. The other example is the strain for developing a vaccine for poultry. Merrick disease is an important disease, and there are 2 strains here that are fusioned, and these are licensed to a major poultry industry player by us. These are again a bioproperty that comes from multiple sources. Example, some of the strains are in fact protected in the pre-2014 era. Some of them could be even as early as 80s, still have strong commercial value and still earn quite a bit of income for the asset owner. So the field of use is poultry vaccine. The rights are again territorially controlled. There's also additionally a reference strain that you also license in. So I think these are combinations that provide access for developing product and delivery in their own right by the licensee. Again, very high value, property cumulatively, with the initial license fee plus milestone fee and the royalties, they could be millions of dollars that flows to the asset owner here. Not necessarily a single owner, but combination of owners there. So we do stack all of these, when it comes to the access provision as such. The other one is a plant gene that's applied in both food and plants themselves. The TPS gene, expresses trehalose. It's kind of a sugar that's quite widely applied by food industry, as well as it's a great plant gene that provides traits in number of crops, abiotic stress traits. So these are again, potentially $1 million, multi-million-dollar licenses that are today applied in the market, and commercial benefit flows coming into inventors. They again are long-term development span, and therefore again number of milestones and market entry based stipulations are made for benefit sharing. And that's all I would say, as in my initial thoughts, and I'm happy to look at questions and comments.
Thank you, sir, for sharing all the knowledge and the experience for specifically related to this topic, which is a very important topic, the bioproperty, how it can be licensed out, or generally all the researchers and scientists, including the startups, they used to have the cell lines from different culture collection centers, and they don't know how to enforce or how to implement the material transfer agreement. Even they are not aware whether we need to share these material, whatever they have taken it from different culture collections, do we actually need to share to the any third party, or how it can be utilized. So those were the wonderful thoughts, sir. And now we have questions, so maybe if I can read out. So one question is basically on, like, if someone has taken out bioproperty, and if there is any mutation or change in the characteristics of the bioproperty, if they made after signing an agreement, so who will own such new strain or new bioproperty? So ownership related question, basically.
So that's a very important question, because invariably we end up, enhancing the value of the bioproperty, either by mutation or by fusioning or whatever way. Most public research access today that are coming from national repositories do stipulate reporting of those, as a prerequisite. Most of them may not stipulate access to that ownership. So that's true in case of public research, especially the federal lab in countries like United States have got into number of agreements with research institutions for this. But invariably, when you access from the private sector, the bioproperty enhancement would have stipulation about reporting, and would also have a model of a license agreement that succeeds it. So these are provided on a research or experimental use basis, and commercialization of that would require benefit sharing models to be entered into with the bioproperty provider. It could be predetermined, it could be open to negotiation on establishment of a commercial value. That really depends on each repository, and also the access entities preferences there. One of the things that also happens is that a lot of them would require copies to be lodged with national system, and there are also stipulations about the stewardship of that. Some countries do provide access to national repositories, as a copy, and those are also restricted by country regulations with respect to public access, and they also limit some of the interest of bioproperty providers to freely provide bioproperty under a standard MTA, and they would stipulate a commercial MTA for them in order to ensure that the research results are reported to them, and if there's a potential to file a patent, that right is exercised. And so it's very, very typical of agreement that relates to either a public institution or a private entity, and the structure of the bioproperty provider.
Generally, when we sign any MTA, I mean any company or any academic institution, they take the material and they sign the agreement. They used to mention like who will own the new strain or the new bioproperty. But yes, sometimes we have to interpret how it, this ownership can be claimed, or how it can be held. So we have another question, basically on how do industries identify, for the source of the bioproperty, like where from we should go for, sourcing the bioproperty. So is there any criteria, or how we should think about, okay, we should go for ATCC or some other agency? So this is the question.
So one thing, is that you have to go by the global repository database, which are actually very well structured because they're well codified, and there is more and more global repository adopting uniform nomenclature. So the keywords that are standard in life science industry should provide the process of search in those databases, and there are also specific repositories of special interest, so that are important for us to look at when we are doing a search. There are, of course, public institutions, there are private enterprises that have global rights. For, a lot of them you'll find that they have the bioproperty in the website, but they don't actually provide the access themselves, right? I mean, even in Cornell today, a number of bioproperty are available on the website, but it will take you to Sigma or some other organization for accessing it, really speaking. So they're given rights to those third-party distributors for them to provide access to that. In the public system, ATCCs are very well, codified repository, but we do also find that some of the European repositories are very well codified. So you can have excellent access, unrestricted in those repositories. Private sector have, for example, you look at enzymes for gene editing. A lot of them would have, tremendous amount of prior execution of documents, confidentiality agreements, before the details are provided to you. So I think there are some that are quite restricted in terms of access, because these are restricted by the owner of the property, and the third parties, have to bind themselves for it. There are, of course, repositories that provide you only for research use purposes. They don't have any commercial rights themselves to provide you, and where you opt to exercise commercial rights, they go back to the original owner to secure it for you. So I think the codification is quite exhaustive today, and we do build that expertise to see how those search engines can be optimized today for multi option that can pop up when you're looking for those bioproperty.
So the another question is on in case plant tissue or entire plant is collected for commercial purpose from the farmer's field or private entity by any company, is formal consent from owner of agriculture field is sufficient, or any other formalities are required to be undertaken?
I mean, it depends on country to country. In many countries, free commercial bioproperty that's out there in the cultivation. There are no restrictions on collections. But in India, there is a very special stipulation of farmers' rights, and therefore there are restrictions, and there are what they call as block level management committees of these resources. So there are elements where when you are collecting a specimen from the field, they would require the BMC to evaluate whether they have any kind of a farmer's rights in that or not. But otherwise, universally, the breeding research always goes by collecting specimens at large, both the domiciled as well as domesticated. So most countries don't have any restrictions on that, really speaking. And if they're applied as parent lines for breeding.
Right, sir. So another question is on like, should discounts be allowed in calculation of net sales when the royalty sharing is based on the net sales? The licensee might provide hefty discount to related party in order to lower the royalty payment. So what should be done in such cases?
Yeah. So there are, when it comes to bioproperty, I mean, there is of course always this general debate about what is net sales when it comes to benefit sharing assessment of royalty payable. When it comes to bioproperty, there are two methods by which this is overcome. Generally, let's say you sell plantlets. There is always a standard in the industry of 10 to 15% plantlets going senile, not good for replanting. So these are given away or not counted as revenue. But when you look at discounts on sale value, we have number of ways in which counter check that, right? One is the production records to see what has been the regeneration production, if it's a tissue culture unit for that matter. Second is the declarations to authorities in terms of units produced. So that provides a quantitative assessment. Qualitative assessment sometimes also results in deep discounting, but those are ones where you really look at supplier verification and things like that. If it's doubts about, are they genuine or not. A related party transaction with a deep discount is, completely against the transfer pricing principle. So they'll be treated on par with market price and royalty will be levied. So the transfer pricing is one stipulation we do make in every licensing agreement, that any kind of beneficial pricing to related party will be treated on par with market price for computing royalty. So the computational differentiation is always made good there. So those are some of the things. And if it's a product that are commercially leviable with the GST and other the taxes, we do look at tax records to see whether these are on par with the industry declarations, really speaking, as a price comparable. Yeah, this is always an important element to look at net sales, and sometimes the licensee may over project number of samples issued. So we also put limitations on quantum of samplification so that they are not exorbitant or extraordinary. So those are some of the checks and balances we do.
Right, sir. So another question is on apple rootstock. He's referring to the example which we had in the slides. In case of apple rootstock or similar licensed registered plant varieties, how to monitor or control further multiplication of licensed varieties at the level of growers or small nurseries?
So it's in case of rootstocks, it's by physical possession, absolutely. When it comes to any plant genetics, the parental lines are absolutely controlled property, and the derivatives are one that are put to markets as a sale product. So the generator of the derivatives will have to keep physical control of the property. That's very important. And of course, the plant variety protection would also be available for crops, and therefore it's essential to also file PVP, across the territories where these are licensed. So those are two frameworks of protection that really are necessary there. In variety, it's not more difficult in country where there are no contractual obligation enforcement. In countries where varieties are licensed, they are monitored by farmer contracts. But in small farm holding like India, it's just not possible. So varieties are less amenable to control, and there the trademarks are one way in which a bit of product differentiation is done for distinctiveness of the product itself.
Right, sir. Sir, another question is on the benefit sharing agreement between the National Biodiversity Authority and the Educational Institute. So the question is about like NBA requires indemnification from educational institutes, whereas the educational institutions, they are apprehensive to provide any indemnity. Should institutes give such indemnification, and how can they negotiate on this with NBA?
I mean, it's a real difficult task for any institution, because institutions today, especially those engaged in plant research, have not maintained extensive records of their breeding program. And the pedigree information origin. So in the absence of information, indemnification is a broad spectrum liability they take. So it's a challenge, and that kind of limits the access of the public property by the developing entity. It's a challenge today. I think they're trying to find a way in which this can be addressed, but there are no solutions today currently, I would say. There are some institutions with excellent documentation in the recent years of database management, and those are the ones that are forthcoming to at least provide more distinct information on pedigree, their own research material, their own derived material, and things like that. At least in an information-rich environment, those indemnification may be feasible, but in a very, very poor information prevalent institutions, it's really difficult today.
So another question is also relates to the NBA approval. If a cell line is originating from source within the India itself, so do we require any NBA approval before licensing it to a company outside India?
So if the property is proposed for patenting, obviously there is a prior consent of NBA for protecting the asset. If the property is treated as a trade secret, there is a challenge today in disclosing information to NBA because it's a trade secret, and the committees today reviewing that do have access to some critical information there. It's a problem unaddressed as of now, but they would certainly require. I mean, if you're looking at a cell line derived from within the country, they treat it as a bioproperty, and then therefore require that that be declared, and the committee would take a view on benefit sharing stipulations clearly. I mean, they have stipulated benefit sharing for some of the organisms derived from environment, such as air today. They have stipulated benefit sharing for organisms derived from soil. So I think those are ones where every kind of biomaterial derived other than human material today, they've been stipulating a benefit sharing model clearly.
So, sir, I don't see any other question. So these were the questions. And if any participant has any other question, they can raise their hand. We can unmute you, and you can directly ask if there is any other question. So we don't see any other question. Thank you, sir. Thank you for taking out time. And sir is there. Sir will give the closing remarks.
I think Vijay, I think you always, whenever you speak, the slide deck might be sometimes similar, but always new comes out from your speech, and we learn a lot. That much I can say, and I think same must have been the experience of all of us who attended your webinar today. So I think we were privileged to have you to guide us and speak to us. In spite of your busy schedule, I, on behalf of the entire specialized services team at BIRAC and behalf of the TTO, give a heartfelt thank to you for sharing your thoughts and experience with us today. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Wonderful.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.